Evening, everyone. It is 6 p.m. and I will call this meeting of the Lunenburg Town Council to order. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Before I look for a motion to approve the agenda, this is the last meeting that's to be staffed by our interim CAO, and so he has, with great reluctance, consented to some form of acknowledgement about that fact. I personally think that the town and the community owe Kevin a great debt of gratitude for the amount of progress and change he's been able to make since taking on the role of interim CAO. While his tenure has been short, though not as short as he'd have liked it to be, I think the impacts of it will be felt for years to come on this community and this organization. And I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank Kevin for his service.
Thank you very much.
I can assure you he found that excruciating, but it was very necessary.
It's the only way the interim gets removed.
All right. With that, we'll have a motion to approve our agenda as circulated, moved by Councillor Sanford, seconded by Councillor Birtles. Any additions or deletions? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed, the motion is carried. Now we're on to the May 10th meeting minutes. Can I get a motion to approve those as circulated? Moved by Councillor Ernst, seconded by Councillor Duggan. Any errors or omissions to note? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed, motion carried. There are no public hearings, presentations, or questions, and there are no correspondence, petitions, or proclamations consideration. That takes us on to unfinished business, and the first item of unfinished business is the electric utility LED streetlight conversion study results. I will pass the floor to the finance director to introduce the presenter and then have the presentation.
Sure. Thank you, Your Worship. So Lucas Doucette is here with us this evening from Strum Engineering, and he has a presentation to review the report with council.
Hi, everyone, Mr. Mayor and Town of Lunenburg representation. I appreciate you taking the time to allow me to speak about the report that Strum Engineering is presenting. With that, we'll move forward. So Strum Engineering Associates Limited is a company that has three offices throughout Atlantic Canada, one office in St. John, New Brunswick, one in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, and one in Sydney, Cape Breton. Strum Engineering specializes in industrial and utility scale electrical engineering services. That includes items such as utility distribution, substation design, generation, and so on and so forth. Moving forward, Town of Lunenburg has contracted Strum Engineering to perform an LED street lighting study. Town of Lunenburg was legislated by Nova Scotia provincial government to have all of their streetlights upgraded to LED by the end of 2022. So with that, Strum Engineering was contracted to review the exposure that the town of Lunenburg has with respect to high pressure sodium lighting versus LED lighting. So our methodology for our report was basically to follow a systematic approach, which was a site survey of the town of Lunenburg, which determined the light fixtures, installation methods, and quantities of different styles of LED lighting. We collected manufacturers' data sheets and product availability to determine appropriate solutions for these light fixtures. We reviewed the available funding through Efficiency Nova Scotia. I will touch on that in this presentation, but I'm not going to go into a significant amount of detail because of the nature of the funding situation. We performed a calculation of energy and cost savings associated with the upgrade to LED lighting. And as you're aware, we did develop a comprehensive report, and this presentation summarizes that report from a simpler perspective. Next slide, please. So the scope of work was contained to the Old Town and New Town Lunenburg systems. So from New Town, the UNESCO heritage site, and the Old Town being the area that's, Old Town being the UNESCO heritage site, and New Town being the newer section of Town of Lunenburg. So one of the major considerations from this report, especially for the recommendations, as far as the lighting recommendations go, is that the setbacks between the housing and the streets in Old Town Lunenburg are significantly smaller than the setbacks in New Town Lunenburg, which with that, the result of that is basically that street lighting tends to be a bit more offensive to the residents of the town of Lunenburg. So our consideration in those environments is basically to use a lower color temperature lighting solution. So a typical street light is 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin. And that would be that typical LED blue light that you see. Whereas we would suggest in areas such as Old Town where the setbacks are less, to avoid the offensive lighting, we would suggest something along the lines of 1,800 Kelvin lighting, which would feel more along the lines of candlelight or sunset style lighting versus that offensive blue LED lighting. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to go through here is the different styles of installations, as well as the considerations as far as installation go. So this image on the screen is an image of a high pressure sodium light. So this is a light that needs to be replaced under this project. The high pressure sodium light, you can see that it's very near the top of the pole, and those lines that are above the light, those are 4,160 volt electrical lines. The high voltage, considered utility voltage, presents problems for non-utility personnel. Basically, that's considered to be in the primary zone, and the only authorized people without explicit authorization by Nova Scotia Power are Nova Scotia Power to work in those areas. Contractors can get approval to work in those areas, although they have to go through a process with Nova Scotia Power. So consideration toward getting Nova Scotia Power involved to either A, perform the work, to perform the replacements for these lights that are in the primary zone, or B, provide authorization to a contractor to make these replacements will need to be further developed, I suppose. Next slide, please. So this would be what I would consider an installation that is below the secondary line. So this is one of the high pressure sodium lights that during replacement, consideration to the utility is less required because it's not in the primary zone. A contractor can do the work without authorization through Nova Scotia Power. This specific pole, for your information, is considered to be an atypical installation because of the location of the transformer. It's called an underslung transformer, but that's not part of this discussion today. Next slide, please. So this would be an under the secondary LED light installation. So this would be a light that we do not need to replace. It's properly installed. It's considered to be an effective solution. It has an LED light. So these are the lights that we've omitted from the costing calculations, as it doesn't need to be replaced. Next slide, please. And then this installation it's a high pressure sodium light. So this one does need to be replaced, but once again, it's in an installation that Nova Scotia Power consideration does not need to be considered. So this pole only has low voltage electrical supply to it. So concerns about distance to the high voltage lines is not present. Next slide, please. So throughout the UNESCO heritage area, there are some what we call, or what we've termed, historic style non-LED lighting. These lights will also need to be replaced under this project. But they do require additional consideration because to replace like for like, it's a bit more of a sourcing, not issue, but it's a sourcing task. So we do present in this slide deck some opportunities for very similar replacements for these lights. Nonetheless, this is historic lighting fixture number 1 of 4. Next slide, please. Similarly, this would be another historic style fixture. The difference between this and the last is that it's installed on a custom pole instead of on a utility pole. So these ones would also have to be replaced by the same means. In a lot of these cases, if not all of these cases, these lights should be replaced without having to replace the pole themselves. So it'd be just the head of the light that needs to be replaced with a very similar fixture with an LED light source instead of the incandescent light source that's available. Next slide, please. So these lights, there's only two sets of these specific two-head historic style fixtures. Similarly, we'll have to replace those with an LED source. Next slide, please. Our recommendation for these orange, let's call them artistic historic style lighting. Our suggestion, because of the challenges to source something of similar nature to that light, we would suggest that those be replaced with the equivalent lighting fixture that is chosen for the historic fixtures 1 and 2. As you can imagine, that's a creative fixture that will be hard to duplicate. Next slide, please. So these are LED fixtures that can replace those, and as you can see, they are very similar in aesthetic to what's available currently, or to what's currently present in the installations. The center fixture, you'll see that it doesn't have the refractor center of it. We do recommend that the refractor is installed. A light with a refractor is installed in all cases. The refractor allows better control of the light distribution, keeps the offensiveness of the light within our control. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of our findings from our streetlight survey. Basically, throughout our streetlight survey, we broke down the survey into our first objective was to determine the quantities of lights that were LED versus high pressure sodium, which is the typical installation from in the past, whereas LED is the typical installation today. High pressure sodium versus LED, and then also whether it be in the primary zone, as discussed earlier, with consideration to Nova Scotia Power installation, on a secondary pole, which would have no high voltage concerns, or on a pole that had primary, but it was below the high voltage area. So the concerns are mitigated. Our findings were that there are 177 installations. There are 177 installations total that are in the high voltage zone. So those would be the poles that need Nova Scotia Power consideration before they can be replaced. Basically, just to make sure that the contractor or whoever ends up doing the work performs the replacement safely. The low voltage installation poles are approximately 50 of those, and the low voltage zone. So that would be a pole with high voltage primary, but also below the concerning area. And lastly, there's 148 low voltage pole installations. The low voltage pole installations include both poles that don't have that high voltage area, as well as the historic style lighting. Next slide, please. So our estimations for the completion of the replacement of all of the lighting is $411,075. And that estimation comes from the idea that any pole mounted fixture would require three personnel to make the replacement, and it would take approximately 2 hours per replacement. And then for the historic style lighting, the 33 replacements you see at the bottom, the 68,000, that would require 2 people without a bucket truck to make those replacements. 2 people, 2 hours without a bucket truck. So that's our estimation. Yeah, next slide, please. From an energy cost savings, 71,833 kilowatts per year would approximately, assuming that each of these streetlights operate for on average 12 hours a day, 12 hours in a 24-hour period. We estimate that 71,833 kilowatts will be saved across the replacements of all of these lights, which is a total energy cost savings of $8,974 per year. Next slide, please. Thank you. And any questions?
Thank you. Lucas, if you can just turn your mic there off there, Lucas, thank you. Questions, Councillor Halverson?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And a couple quick questions on the primary zone lighting. Is there a chance, I'm assuming no matter what we do with that, because where they're positioned now, Nova Scotia Power personnel have to come in anyway. But when are we going to reposition them so that they're away from the primary, so we don't need Nova Scotia Power personnel coming in to deal with it in the future?
I don't think we've gotten that far in our conversation, Councillor Harrison, about whether we move them or not. We would have to look at individual cases about whether that could be done or not. But certainly there are options for non-Nova Scotia Power staff to do that. That what Lucas is indicating is just that has to be part of consideration. There's a standard protection code that has to be in place. And if a contractor has that, then they're able to do that. There's also perhaps an option for a Nova Scotia Power person to shadow the crew to make that work as well. But yes, I mean, ideally it would be to get them out of that primary zone and have them at the lower installation. So we wouldn't have to deal with that in the future.
So I just want to be clarified then, so that the plan is to try and move whatever we can out of that zone, so we're not dealing with this in the future. Okay. Second question is on the fixtures. You alluded to the historic style and mentioning the refractors. There were the 3 that were presented. We weren't recommending the middle one. Is there a chance we can just go, instead of, I think at one point we had 4, we're talking maybe 3 or 2 at this point. Is there one that we can decide on that would, satisfy the historic requirements instead of having to source 2 or 3 different styles? So we can just have a uniform one fixture for the Old Town Historic.
So my hope would be that we would pick one. Like, I know we have 3 different installations.
Yes.
Currently, well, really 4, I guess, if we can, the orange ones, but we're going to move those to one of these other ones. But one of these options, which really are 2 options, for all of those kind of historic fixtures that we would use the same through.
Can I interject with just a follow up to your question, Councillor Halverson? Sure. The historic fixtures don't really have any heritage value.
No,
they're aesthetic purely.
Yeah, we just need them that.
Yeah, no, I get that, but this is my question is, would there be a potential savings in just replacing them with normal streetlights? Like, why bother replacing them with anything but normal streetlights?
Some would be an issue with the fact that they're already on they're on specially mounted poles.
Mm-hmm.
So then we would have to think, is there another pole there to do that, and those sort of things. I mean, that's consideration we could put in place. If we wanted to move away from those, that's certainly an option. But we haven't moved any further.
Is it going to be cheaper if we do that?
I think we're close to the same, Lucas.
So from our perspective, specifically for the poles that have the lights that have the custom poles, it'd be very challenging to suggest there would be an alternative that would be cheaper, because there would be no mounting consideration in those areas, and those poles would have to be removed. So those costs would have to be considered as well. As for the lighting fixtures that I think it was historic fixture 1 out of 4, they're mounted to utility poles. So for those ones, we could consider alternatives a little bit more easily. That would be my answer.
Okay.
And just to one final comment, I do appreciate the work that's gone into ensuring that the color temperature is acceptable. That was obviously a matter of some discussion within the community, and I think your suggestion really does address a lot of the concerns. So thank you for doing that. Much appreciated. Yeah, I will ask. Sorry, I yield the floor. Actually, that's enough questions. Steven's got his hand up there.
All right, we'll move to councillors for a question.
Thank you. I'd actually just like to sort of go more or less on the opposite of what the mayor was saying. Is there any opportunity of adding more of the aesthetic style, we'll say, fixtures throughout? Particularly, I'm thinking like the downtown section of Old Town. It's sort of a conglomerate mixture of stuff right now of the decorative poles and then the mounted lights. So is there an opportunity of maybe having something a little more uniform? And as you probably guess, I'm leaning more towards the traditional looking fixtures. Is that an option?
So we did chat about that briefly. And I think that we had determined that replacing an overhead, like Cobra style, like traditional street light, with those historic fixtures on a pole mount, like on a light pole mounted, were not necessarily a good swap out.
It-
Right? So
As far as that replacement goes, there are considerations that can be done to make that happen, but I would suggest that would add significant cost because of the modifications to the electrical system that would be required. It is a consideration that we can make, but nonetheless, some more thought would certainly have to be put into it.
Okay, any further questions at this stage? Councillor Sanford?
Would it be possible, further to what Councillor Halverson was saying, when we were campaigning, heard a lot about the lights, the type of light that was shining in the streets. And I'm hearing you address that. So to Councillor Ernst's point, does the lighting on those poles, so the historic lighting, would that be a way to reduce other than, and you referred to what the term was, 1800, whatever that was. Thank you. So would it be possible to reduce the light by those historic light fixtures?
So I suppose is the question, if we were to replace the Cobra style typical lighting throughout the historic area with historic style lighting, would that assist with the lighting levels? It is possible, although these LED Cobra head lighting, we have quite a bit of control over where the LED light actually distributes its light. So there are basically, without getting into too much detail, there are 5 different styles of light distributions from these lights, and we'd be picking a light distribution that appropriately shines only onto the street with, like I say, this candlelight style lighting, which is the 1800 Kelvin that you refer to, which should mitigate the concerns about light pollution in those areas. As far as the historic lighting goes, I would suggest that the same issues would come to play, as in we would select a lighting distribution in these lights in those corridors that is equivalent to what we would pick for the overhead lighting. Yeah, I suppose that's my answer.
Okay, Councillor Halverson?
Just to follow up on your comment there, I don't want to open this can of worms, but as you mentioned, there's so much. We're able to control so many variables with the LED lighting. How do you make the determination on where the light is spilled? And the reason I ask this, obviously in neighborhoods, when we start getting up into Old Town, having a light just on the street would be preferred because of the close proximity up to the road, and you don't really want it spilling into yards. But when you start looking at the main streets, Montague, Pelham, Lincoln, there are sidewalks there, and having some spillage onto the sidewalk is helpful in the evening. So what consideration is there at this point for the different parts of town?
Yeah, so as far as the consideration to date when it comes to that, as far as through Newtown, so the Lincoln Street and so forth, we would be using what Nova Scotia Power's typical standard for that basically for areas where the houses are far enough back. We'd be using Nova Scotia Power's typical standard for their overhead lighting, which does include provision for light spillage wouldn't be the term, but nonetheless light spillage back to those sidewalks to ensure that those areas are covered in light. So basically there's, like I said, there's 5 different types of lighting distribution, and one of those types of lighting distribution is for a very thin distribution that goes basically perpendicular to the LED fixture, which would be for small corridors, whereas another light distribution of those 5 would be a wider array of light coming out of that fixture. So simply put, in those areas in Newtown, the light fixture would be a 4,000 Kelvin light that provides light distribution in a little with a light distribution angle that's a little wider than in those small corridors.
Yeah, I think again, the Newtown Old Town distinction does make sense. I appreciate what you're saying about Newtown, but there are distinctions even within an Old Town. The areas I'm referencing, Lincoln, Pelham, they're actually in Old Town just down the street here, but there are main business districts and restaurant districts. So in the evenings, there are people down there. So having some spill in those areas, even though there may be there are living accommodations above the businesses. So perhaps, I don't know where the lights are positioned on the pole. If it's spilling down, then it's not an issue. But there would be a preference, I'm sure, for some people to have some coverage on the sidewalk as well as the street. But of course, those are just in those corridors where there's business, not necessarily up in the residential area up and behind here where there are where the sidewalks don't exist. So, are we looking at just like a 2-zone plan, a 3-zone plan? Are we going road by, will there be road by road consideration?
There will have to be some consideration of the different areas, even within the areas, just because of the different activity that occurs within those, just to make sure that we have enough lighting for safety, right? Because that's part of the reason why we have street lighting to begin with.
As a deputy mayor next.
Thank you, Worship. A few years ago, we've been talking about this for a long time, and there seemed to be, even in my first council, some urgency to have this conversion done. And it was explained to me at the time that the longer we waited, the more money we'd be saving on the lighting itself. And I'm looking at a $400,000 bill here, and obviously we've only been allocating $100,000 for this. So why is this so much more expensive now? Or is this actually more expensive now than it would have been, say, 8 years ago when we first looked at this?
Well, I guess my estimate when we were doing the budgets, we weren't far enough along in the study to have the level of estimate we have now. So that was maybe hopeful on my behalf. But as far as, 8 years ago or so when this first came out, I think there was concerns about the lights not lasting as long and those sort of things. And we're hoping for some revisions in technology to move us forward. But unfortunately, I can't give you exact comparisons of what, was going on 8 years ago compared to now. Unfortunately, things do go up in cost. But we hope that we have a light that will, be able to be, that 5 different options and those sort of things may not have been the same technology that we would have had available to us for those considerations, but 8 years ago.
Okay. I've got 2. The first one is just with relation to the idea of, what formula we're using, setbacks and all that kind of stuff. There are a number of areas we've designated for infill as growth nodes that have similar setbacks to Old Town. And I'm just less for this conversion than the future. I'm just wanting to make sure is the plan to factor that in for those zones that would have sort of a similar setback to Old Town?
We would, now that we have the report, certainly I need to sit down with the planning department and sort of discuss some of those things as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Come up with some sort of algorithm, formula, whatever.
Sure.
And the second thing is, being a fully fledged graduate of the Peter Mosier School of Municipal Budgeting, what does this unanticipated borrowing do to our tax rate for next year?
Well, the borrowing is actually going to be in the electric utility. So it wouldn't impact the tax rate. No.
If I had been a good student, I'd have known that already. It'll affect your light bill. Yeah. There. Okay, well, then I'll ask it that way. What would it do on the light bill?
I actually can't give you that, Your Worship, unfortunately. I mean, the overall capital budget for the electric utility is slightly different than perhaps our capital budget in the town, where we have estimates of how many poles we think we're going to have to replace based on age and storms and activity in the community and those sort of things. So there can be options sometimes where we may not have to do that borrowing, but at this point, based on what we've got, that's what we anticipate it to be, but I can't convert it exactly into a light bill for you at this point.
Okay, I appreciate that. And as you can all tell, I wasn't a cum laude graduate. Any further questions at this stage? I've got the CAO wanting to weigh in.
Lucas, 2 quick questions. One is for the high voltage zone installs. We have 177 of them, right? And I don't want to set back to Councillor Halverson's question earlier. What's our timeline right now? If we just go with the plan that we have, how tight is it to have these installed by December 31st?
Sorry, we've got a couple mics on.
Sorry, no, we were just trying to decide which one of us had the information. We've calculated based on the Strum report that we need 18 weeks sort of to carry this out. Now, if we break that into two parts, the high voltage versus the other, we may be able to overlap that, but essentially we need 18 weeks overall to carry out this work.
So how much will making changes to the current location of those high voltage installations mean to the timeline and the cost at the end of the day? I mean, even if we only did 10 or 20%, it's going to make it.
It shouldn't actually change it that much. Like if you're just taking the one down from the high voltage and moving it down below, assuming that you don't have to change anything else on the pole, because we wouldn't do that if we had to actually do that perhaps, then it shouldn't be any extra additional cost for the installation at a lower level.
Just want to be clear on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Any further questions at this stage? Counselor Sanford?
Which lasts longer, a metal pole or a wooden pole?
Certainly a metal pole would last longer, but I guess in what context?
If we're putting in poles, if we have to put in poles.
So these the light fixtures that we're replacing, they're on the utility poles, at least other than the 33 that are the historic style lighting. The others are installed on utility poles, so there wouldn't be an opportunity to replace those poles with anything that would last longer. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Anything further? Seeing nothing, there's a draft motion provided. Is it anybody's pleasure to move it? Moved by Councillor Halverson, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Somewhat begrudgingly. Is there any discussion or debate? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. And thank you, Lucas, for your presentation. All right, there are no committee meeting minutes, recommendations, reports, or notices of motion. That takes us on to new business and the water and wastewater quarterly information reports. The acting town engineer is here to provide those, and I will turn the floor over to her.
Thank you, Your Worship. From January to March, all weekly and monthly regulatory water testing and in-house daily testing complied with all of the approval requirements. The average daily and maximum daily flows did not exceed the limits of our water withdrawal application, permit. There were 5 leaks reported this quarter for our water mains. Moving on to the wastewater update. The required number of tests per month were carried out and all the pH tests were within our required ranges. There were 2 instances in February where E. coli levels were above the provincial standards. Nonetheless, on a quarterly average basis, which is the basis for meeting the provincial and federal requirements, the test results met these requirements. So,
Thank you, acting engineer. Are there any questions at this stage? Seeing none. All right. Councillor Sanford, apologies.
Always. First of all, I want to say thank you for adding in the rainfall amounts in the graphs that you were projecting there. I'm really happy to see that. And I'm looking forward to seeing it over a year so we can see if there's any correlation between the two. I was curious when I looked at this, and maybe you can help me to understand, how is it that we had more flow between November and March when those are what I would consider to be quieter times of the year here in the town? So I'm just trying to understand, how do we have more output in flow at a quieter point in time in the operations of the town? I would have expected to see those higher amounts in that, June to October window, but it seems to be the opposite, or maybe.
Are you referring to the
wrong.
wastewater flow?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
So it actually has to deal with the amount of precipitation during that time, because a lot of our system is still a combined storm and sewer. So most of that flow during those months, because you're right, there's less like population in the town at the time. And that's because we're treating a large quantity of stormwater during that time.
Okay, so without seeing that storm, without seeing the water flows in those summer months, then
That's
you
right.
can't extrapolate that.
Yeah, so within, you know, in a year from now, when you can see the
Yeah.
precipitation over a year, I think that will be a lot clearer for you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect. Any further questions? All right, seeing none, that takes us on to proposed revisions of the noise bylaw. I will turn it over to staff to summarize the proposed changes very quickly, and then we will give that first reading if the council is so inclined.
Thank you, Your Worship. This report deals with short-term and midterm solutions to concerns raised by the community about the 20-year-old noise bylaw. In March, the town was notified that a request from the town to amend the provincial summary offense ticket regulations to include offenses under bylaw 58, which is our noise bylaw, was approved by the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice. The public was notified of the changes as required, and other questions about the bylaw overall were raised at that time. The town has a full bylaw and policy review scheduled for 22-23. MC Advisory have been contracted to carry out this work, which will begin in the fall of 2022. In the short term, this report contains draft amendments to deal with certain targeted changes only, namely updating the penalty information per provincial direction, a private fireworks ban due to concerns expressed about noise and safety, and adjusting the evening quiet time hours from a half hour beyond sunset to a fixed time, such as 11 p.m., which is more predictable and may remove the need for certain exemption applications. Staff are suggesting in the first draft motion that these revisions be given a first reading and schedule a public hearing. In the midterm, an explanatory release about the changes to the bylaw mentioned public consultation. Therefore, staff recommend an online survey be circulated with print copies made available at Town Hall to solicit feedback. This data would then go to the consultants as part of the more comprehensive review to come. So there's a second draft motion there that gives this instruction to staff. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions at this stage? Councillor Halverson?
Just one point here. The penalty section, just the way it's written here, the enforcement body is the town of Lunenburg's designated policing provider, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, Lilydale Detachment. I'm just thinking, just for clarity, in case that should change, this bylaw should, exceed, perhaps if they're no longer our, that maybe we get detachment service out of Chester or somewhere else. Could we just say RCMP?
Or just
or whatever
designated policing
force?
provider,
Yes.
period.
Exactly, as opposed to, just strike the rest of it after policing provider. Yeah.
I think we can accept that as an amendment by unanimous consent. Yes, okay. Any further questions? Councillor Duggan?
When would we look at setting a specific time? Is that after the public consultation is done?
No, so the amendments provided by staff set the time proposed at 11 p.m. Basically the intent is to get this done before the summer months, which is when a lot of these issues tend to arise. So for now, the staff are proposing that the time would be amended currently to, at this stage, and going forward to public hearing for this bylaw amendment to amend the time to 11 a.m. or p.m. rather. 11. Don't need any more grief by making it 11 a.m. So it would be 11 a.m. under this, and then follow-up consultation after the
Okay.
summer.
Is there room to negotiate that time? Is that a typical time? I feel like usually it's 10 p.m. But
You're certainly within your rights as a councillor to make an amendment to 10 p.m. at this stage, or to propose an amendment. 10, in my estimation, and staff can correct me here, 10 or 11. 11 seems to be the most standard, 10 after that.
Yeah, a quick search of a number of municipalities, we felt the majority, and the ones in the most immediate region to us are all around 11 o'clock. So we went with 11, but clearly it's, it's an either or situation.
I mean, I would be curious to know what other people think. I think that 11 sounds a little bit late, but I would be more comfortable with 10 PM if anyone else has any input.
Councillor Halverson?
Yeah, I think at this point, we're kind of getting in the nitty gritty. This is something I'd like to hear from the community on. I think just to get this done. And if the consensus right now around the neighboring municipalities is 11 o'clock, I'm happy to go forward at this point with 11 o'clock and then hear from the community to find out if they prefer 10 or 11. I think the seven of us here can have 7 different opinions between 10 or 11, and that might not necessarily reflect what we want. So I think just getting something out the door, and again, if we can go with that as consistent at this point, I'm happy to go with 11.
Okay, I'm seeing head nods around the table. All right. Is there any further questions of staff discussion? Seeing none, there is a draft motion provided. It has not been moved and seconded with Councillor Halverson's amendment by unanimous consent to remove RCMP and talk about our designated police provider. To generalize that to avoid future amendments. It has been moved by Councillor Halverson and seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Is there any further discussion and debate? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried and staff are so ordered to advertise that for public hearing and second reading. There is now the secondary motion, which is to instruct staff to conduct a public consultation to survey, to solicit feedback and report for a more comprehensive review of the noise bylaw to follow later in the year. Are there any questions on that? I have one, and I'm just wondering, I understand the intent here, but would it not be more fruitful to just do a general consultation with respect to our bylaw and policy review with the community and do it all in one swoop rather than pick this out and be so specific?
The suggestion of the survey really just came out when we were initially putting out the public comment back in March. So but it never specified what form that would take. So whatever council's preferences, we're completely ready to support you.
So yeah, my suggestion to council would be that we don't do it in this fashion, but we do some sort of public consultation with respect to our bylaw review and come back with a fuller approach, online survey or something to that effect, if and when the time comes. Is that, just wondering if people are amenable to that? Council? Yeah, so I think we can leave that motion off and we'll do because there are other things, other sort of irritants and community issues that I think we should get the community's view on in doing a bylaw review. All right, that is the end of our public agenda. I need a draft, there's a draft motion there, sorry. I need a motion to move that we meet in camera and discuss the following items pursuant to section 22 of the Municipal Government Act, moved by Councillor Duggan, seconded by Councillor Sanford. Any discussion or debate? Seeing none, all those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried and we will